Okay, so welcome to the Krishnacore Chronicles. This is number 23, and I have this afternoon the amazing Kate Reddy from 108. How are you? You okay?
I'm good, actually.
Um, so I do have a number of questions to ask you, and the first one is obviously I know people who's listening in and watching in probably know who you are, but can you just introduce yourself and give
Oh
you
yeah,
a
yeah,
bit
yeah.
of a background and oh.
Um, so like my hardcore background or just in general. Okay. I think for the purposes of this podcast, people know me as the guitar player of 108. So because this is like a Krishnacore podcast, that's probably the most relevant. But I actually did quite a few bands before that, starting when I was in the eighth grade. I
Yeah.
sang for a hardcore band called Last Action when I was in eighth
All
grade,
right.
which is funny because at the time, so it was 1986, there were 86. Yeah, I guess it was the summer of 1986. There were not a lot of girls that sang for hardcore bands. So I was like, I don't really know how I'm like, I didn't have anyone to model myself on. So I just tried my best. And then I did some other bands. I did a band called Growing Up Skipper, and I played guitar in that band, and I played bass in a band called All Fall Down when I was in high school. And yeah, so I've done a couple of different things. I recorded this 7 inch with a couple friends, and it's called The Giving Tree, which
Oh yeah.
actually like was kind of a cool little project. But at the time I was doing that, then I moved into the temple, so I didn't kind of stay with it. But so 108 was my big project that I did. And what else about me? I'm the mother of three children who are all grown up now, and my husband and I started Equal Vision Records, and we still run Equal Vision Records, although he does really runs it, and I don't really run it.
Good stuff.
It's really his project more than mine, even though my name is on the paperwork. That's about all. That's my contribution. So,
Good stuff. So, if people are watching this, that that book, the Peterson, is one of the only few books I can really kind of discusses the idea about hardcore and spirituality. And there's a great chapter in there, and you're in this, aren't you? I don't know the exact date of the book. I probably can't see without my glasses, but it's not a new book. Um,
I think it came out like early 2000s or something.
yeah, yeah. 2009. So yeah. So in this you discuss your hippie parents. So
Oh,
so could you tell me your first experiences with the consciousness movement? Um, a little bit about those experiences, and even perhaps even about the flute lessons that you were
oh,
taking.
okay. The
Yeah.
flute lessons and the oboe playing always somehow
Ah,
make it into these conversations. So when I was a little kid, I literally I was in second grade. I wanted to play the flute. I wanted to play instruments. I always wanted to play instruments when starting as soon as I had the like it was I just remember it as a thing in my life always. So and when you're younger, you have a choice to be like in the school orchestra or the band or whatever. So I I decided, or I asked my mom if I could take lessons to learn to play the flute, and that was because my neighbor, her older sister took flute lessons, and she took the flute lessons from the teacher who lived at the what is called the Vivekananda Vedanta Vihar,
yeah.
which I remembered like working so hard to memorize all those big, words that were so foreign to me. So people would say, "Where do you take your flute lessons?" And I'd say, "Well, simply at the Vivekananda Vedanta Vihara, of course,"
Yeah.
because I was like 7 years old. And I remember the day like waiting, like I had my flute and I was like waiting for the day, and I was like going to be the time, and I was like waiting and waiting on the porch, and my mom was like, "It's another hour," and I was like, I wasn't leaving the steps. So I, so that the where the teacher was this ashram, which is disciple of Sri Ramakrishna, and or actually, wait a second, a disciple of Vivekananda who was Sri Ramakrishna, and then his female consort or counterpart, which was Sharada Devi. So I would go into the ashram, which was in this resort, which is I think it's a very American thing, in the Catskill Mountains in the 1940s and 50s. And I think even maybe in the 1930s, they had these like all-inclusive sort of like hotels. And there is actually, I always say this in interviews, but like if you want to know what that is, you can watch the movie Dirty Dancing. They go to a resort in the Catskills.
Okay.
So it's basically like families would leave New York City. They would why Americans call it vacation instead of holiday, like proper English speakers say, is because people would vacate New York City, and they would, for their vacation, they would go to these places in the Catskill Mountains. And in the 19th century, they would go to like the Catskill Mountain House, and there are all these beautiful places, which some of them burned down. And they had a special train which would take people up the side of the mountain. But at the bottom of the hills, still in the foothills, there were these places called resorts, and the resorts went out of popularity in the 1970s. People started to travel more to different places rather than just sort of coming up, 2 hours from New York City to vacate the city. And um, so that a lot of like it sort of started that these religious organizations started to buy these places because they were like absolutely perfect for an ashram setting, because they have like a dining hall, and then they have these long hallways with many small rooms, and then they have gathering spaces where I'm sure they would have ballroom dancing or something, but they use those as meditation spaces. There's like the Brahma Kumaris bought one. This Swami, who was a disciple of Ramakrishna, bought one. There's actually one where actually John Joseph went as a kid to the resort, is now
Oh,
owned
okay.
by the Hasidic Jews. And they have like Hasidic Jewish camp or what ashram style thing there. Like if you drive by, you can see all the Hasids are there. And so yeah, so this place had been a resort called Balsam Shade, and then this ashram people bought it, and all these hippies moved there, and they were at the time using the main, like, so I think the ballroom, which meditation space. And I remember going, and my mom became friends with the hippie ashram people because she was like very much a hippie herself, and living in this upstate New York town, which was very much like, you know, it still is probably now like it whatever the equivalent of 1970s MAGA people were, which were way better MAGA people, like they just voted for Ronald Reagan or something.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
they live there, and my mom is like, she's like a Cornell University, like protesting the Vietnam War, only woman in the biochemistry PhD program type of thing. Although she didn't finish, but she finished her like all the she never wrote her dissertation. But anyway, she was still, it was radical in the late 1960s, early 1970s. So I'd ride my bike up there with my flute, and I would take lessons, and I started to see, all these images of Krishna and Ram. And they gave me the one ashram lady who, she would travel to India, and she brought back the Mahabharat comic books. So I
Oh,
had
yeah.
and I was really into comic books. I had like a sizable collection of like Richie Rich comic books. For whatever reason, I was really into Richie Rich. I don't know why. And then and I was always wanted to order the sea monkeys on the back, but I never did, which turned out to be good because that was a scam. But yeah, so I had these Mahabharat comic books, and then I remember they were vegetarians, and I remember the smells of the ashram. It smelled like an ashram, so it smelled like good, like spices, Indian spices and incense, and it was just like clean. Everything was decorated in like earth tones and saffron, and I remember
Yeah.
having this feeling of like, I want to do this. And then and my mom's friend, who was named Pat Fogel, she had a house off the campus of the ashram. But and I used to like do like jobs for her, like mowing the lawn and gardening and stuff, which is so funny because I was like 10, but at that time earning your pay at 10 was like fine. I actually literally, my parents thought it was fine to drive a tractor. I was like 10 years old. Sometimes I got myself into some sicky situations. I'm surprised I didn't cut like any of my toes off. But and she had a paved driveway. This is part of the story. So everyone had, it was very rural, but her driveway was paved because I actually found out that she was a very wealthy um, woman she was wealthy because her family had money in Union Carbide, which is significant because that was the place that like poisoned all these people in India. And I remember
Ah,
big drama. Anyway, she somehow was connected to them. She was like an heiress who got into being an ashram. So she had this very beautiful little house. I worked there and she let me roller skate on her driveway because it was the 70s.
yeah.
In hanging in her laundry room where the window faced the driveway was a picture of Krishna's universal form.
Okay.
So I remember just skating back and forth in front of that picture and like being like really attracted. Like, who is that? Who is this Krishna person? Like Krishna and all the different heads of his different incarnations, the sort of the famous one that Jimi Hendrix probably shouldn't have used on his album cover. But so I think from my earliest times, I really had this idea. And then the movie Gandhi came out. And I didn't see it in the theater. I saw it a little bit later on when they had like like VHS tapes. My parents got like a VCR and it was like a big deal. And like all the neighbors came over and we watched um, some different movies. And one of them was the Gandhi movie. And I
Yeah.
remember this moment, like seeing the movie. And are you familiar with the movie?
I've watched it years ago. I
Yeah,
probably
so
can't
there's this
remember. Yeah.
moment that for me was like a moment of being in my childhood. And there's Gandhi in India. And I'm like, I need to go there. I need to go to India so desperately. I was like, I wanted to go. I wanted to see that place. I wanted to be with I wanted to be in that land. And so he has this Western disciple that comes from the UK. And
Okay.
first, you see this part, and the train pulls up, and this very like fancy woman gets off, and she's all dressed like a British lady, and she gets off, and his disciples are like, "Oh, she's in for it." But then it's not her. Another woman gets off, and she's wearing a white sari, and she becomes like his first like Western disciple. And I was like, I identified with that lady so much. She had like blonde hair and everything. It's so funny. So I really wanted to go, and I remember. So the very first time so you had all of that, and then people started to join the Krishnas and hardcore. And I met after some show at CBGB's, I don't remember. I stayed at my friend's house in Brooklyn, and then the person who later would become my husband and Ray Kappa were at the temple because they were kind of getting into it. And they said, meet us at the temple in the morning, and we're driving upstate. You can, skip the train fare. So I went there and I walked into the Brooklyn Temple, and it looks literally almost identical now. Like they've changed very little. And there's like a staircase and a little small two-seater bench at the bottom of the staircase. And they were sitting there and they had plates of the breakfast. And I remember when I walked in, just like almost getting just like a wave of memory washing over me because it smelled exactly like the ashram from when I was a kid. And they had this plates of halava, which is like that, the most delicious thing in the world, basically farina with like sugar and fruits like toasted into it, made into like a pudding. And they were like, and then we're friends from the hardcore scene, and then we get in the car and they just hammer me with whatever philosophy they possibly can
Yeah.
know because they're brand new devotees and they want to tell me everything they know, like every bit of what they had learned. They just first, and it's a 2-hour drive. So they're like, do you know the Bhagavad Gita? And I said, well, I do because we studied, Thoreau in my high school because I went to an alternative high school and I know that he read the Bhagavad Gita. So
Yeah.
I knew a little something. I felt like I had some concept of it and I could engage in the conversation. And they were talking about what prasad is, how, you eat this sanctified food to control your tongue and you chant the names so that you control the mind and you smell incense. So you're kind of engaging all of your senses. And I remember, just feeling like, oh yeah, this is so cool. Plus also these guys were really cool. So I was like, okay, I'm kind of interested because these really cool guys are into it. And they wound up moving to the temple a little like shortly thereafter, maybe even within a few months. And then they went on tour, they moved into the temple, and then, I kind of dabbled in a few things. I went to like the New York Zen Center, and I went to this meditation of light and sound with Takar Singh, and then I just did a few things. I was like seeking, and but basically what happened was eventually I wound up sort of bumping back into Steve, who became my husband, and I was at Lollapalooza, which is hard to do because there was like, I don't know, there was like 80,000 people there. And I'd heard from friends that he had kind of like left the Krishnas, and I was like, oh, that's good. Maybe he'll date me. But I always had a crush on him. He was way too old for me at the time. Our age gap was, and I saw him there, and he was like, wow, you're kind of grown up now, because I was like 19 or something. I went from being like this absolutely totally androgynous, 14-year-old to being like a 19-year-old. So it was like in that span of time. And I mean, I really nailed androgyny. People thought I was a boy all the time.
Right.
That was part of my look. I looked just like a skater. I had a shaved head, like um so yeah, so basically then he took me to the temple. He said, I'm going to be going to the temple. Do you want to try it? And I did. And like, it was the same thing. It was like something, part of it was something from my childhood, was like, just came flooding back. But part of it was this very real longing for whatever that was, that I kept getting pulled back. It's funny because this weekend I was with Krishnadas and Nina, and who are like two of my teachers and dear friends and practically relatives now. Not Krishna, not from the Krishna consciousness movement, but from the Krishna consciousness movement.
Yeah.
A different lineage. And Krishnadas just said, "Come here, I want to talk to you." And I said, "Okay," because he's funny. He's like a New Yorker, and he said, "You're never getting away. I've got you now, and you're never getting away. Don't even try it." And I was like, I felt like Krishna himself almost was saying that same thing. Like every time I turned the corner and there would be Krishna, and then I'd go some other route and I'd turn the corner and there again was Krishna. So for me, it was just like, it just keeps happening in my life that, it just, as many things, as many obstacles as there's been, as much as there's been like difficulties and everything, I just keep,
Yeah.
it keeps staying. So it must be that I feel like that's an indication that I'm in the right place. It's just how, it's like I bought the right house. It just needs a little renovation, maybe. I don't know.
So, um, so Lollapalooza, and you've met Steve again, and
Yeah.
you So, can you tell us a little bit about how you came to be in 108?
Yeah. So actually, like, Steve is a part of that because I joined the temple, and I had been in this band growing up Skipper, and growing up Skipper was sort of getting some traction. It was me and the one of the girls, the bass player was the girl, then she had been in a band, this East Bay punk band called the Yeasty Girls.
Oh yeah.
And then this woman, Laura, and Laura went on to be in a pretty well-known band that I can't remember right now. I can't remember, but she was really cool. She drummed. And we started this basically like feminist sort of, it was before Riot Girls. It was like a proto Riot Girl situation. And we played a bunch of shows like at ABC No Rio, which never really was my total scene. Like I never really quite, I recognized the coolness of it, but I just never felt at home there. My home was more like the youth crew straight edge guys, and which seems crazy, versus a bunch of left wing, more sort of female centered Marxist people. It seems like I would fit in better, but whatever the reason is. But yeah, so we started this band and we recorded a 7-inch, and it came out. The guy from God Is My Co-Pilot had a little record label, and he put it out, and that even was reviewed in Spin magazine. And I think it was Thurston Moore who said it was his favorite 7-inch of whatever year that was, 1994, something. I'm not really in touch with the guy Craig, who's in God Is My Co-Pilot. A few times we've talked, but basically that record, basically that was happening. And then I was kind of getting into joining the Krishnas, and those things were like so in opposition of each other. Like those people were anti-religion and they were, so I would like, I didn't want to mess up my punk rock cred. So I would like put on a sari and then like try to sneak to the subway without anyone catching me. But I lived in a neighborhood where like everyone hung out. So sometimes I remember like passing, there was this place called Benny's Burritos, and it was like, that's probably pre H2O, but the guys that were in, like Toby and his brother, I think were sitting at the outdoor dining eating burritos. And they were like, "What are you doing?" And I was like, "Oh, nothing. I'm just here in the sorry." And then the other, I love the serendipitousness of the whole, like how Krishna arranges things. When I went to Vrindavan the first time, I was like, that's it. I'm gonna wear a bindi dot, you know, and I was like, this is gonna be my big commitment. I'm going to India. So I had a bindi dot that was like this big, which I don't even know
Yeah.
how it was like this Mayavadi jet. It was blue. I remember it was like half the size of my forehead. Because I was like, I'm in it. I'm committed. And we're in JFK, which is one of the largest airports in the world. And our gate to fly to India is right next to Sick of It All, who's flying to Europe to play a tour. And to their credit, they did not bat an eyelash. They did not mention the giant bindi. They did not say anything about my sari. They just said, "Hey, what's up? Where are you going?" So funny, right? Yeah. So I started to basically then, like, after I ran into Steve at Lollapalooza, we kind of started dating. And then he was supposed to go, he went on tour with Into Another for a little while. And then some, I can't remember the timeline of it, but we basically, I started to go to the temple, and then he kind of left, but I just kept going. And I just, I mean, part of the draw, honestly, was the free food. I'm not gonna lie. It was like, oh, well, I can go get, I think it was more than food. It was like nourishment, you know. I think I wasn't feeling myself to be nourished by my family, who were very busy with whatever things they were going through. And I was one of the, you know, I had like these little siblings who were still tiny, and then like two more brothers who were born when I was like 18 and 20. So
Right.
my parents were like, "You're good." They didn't really interact with me very much at all at that time. They were like, "You go do your life." So something about getting to the temple, and there was like all this delicious food, and there were these like benevolent older people who cared about me and who were interested in me and who wanted to teach me things. And also they seemed to me like they never gave up on the dream. They were like still living this totally alternative lifestyle. They didn't like do it for a while and then become, you know,
Yeah.
like start put on a suit. They were stay. So I realized I could go Wednesday and Sunday to Brooklyn, and they had feast both days and chant some, which I loved. I always loved the chanting, and then, you know, get some nice dinner. And it felt like nourishing. And then I realized that I lived just a few blocks from 26 Second Avenue, which is the first temple that Prabhupada. So I lived on 6th Street, and that was on Second, so 4 blocks over. And then I lived in between B and C, and this was on Third Avenue. So you have to go, you know, you have to go B to A, then First, Second, Third Avenue. It's just not far. Could walk there in 10 minutes or something. And I started to go there and listen to the classes and listen to the, you know, do the chanting and everything. And it drew me in, and it just became so important. But then, you know, when you get in the beginning, it's all this like, you know, I guess it's like any new relationship. But then I realized that there started to, like, some things started to come, like I started to notice some things about like where the women were standing off to the
Yeah.
side, or they weren't, like, you know, all these things. It started to like click a little, and I was worried about that stuff. And basically what happened was, you know, and I just given up being in this like essentially a riot girl band, was a feminist punk band and everything. The opportunity came that Vrej Kishore Vic was kind of leaving Shelter and was going to start his own band. And somehow, and I don't remember this, but my husband reminded me of it. So I'm telling his story because I don't have one of my own. What he saw, he kind of Rob from Resurrection was getting into Krishna, and they needed a singer because there was going to be a new band,
That's
108.
right.
It's gonna
Yeah.
splinter off. Yeah. And Vic was originally, I think he sang a lot of the songs, but they needed someone who would do that part. And so they got two guys from Resurrection, which was Chris Daly and Rob Fish. Um and there was another guy at the temple, Tony, who was like kind of, he was a hardcore kid, and they got him to play bass, but they wanted to get me to play guitar. And it saved me because it gave me, I don't know if I would have survived what was available to women in the temple at that time, because I didn't really like to do like the typical female stuff. I still don't like. There would be like, wrap this gift so beautifully, and I'm like, oh no, I can't. I mean, even my own son believed in Santa Claus till he was like really old, because he's like, I know my mother cannot wrap gifts like that, and he couldn't figure out that we gave them to the people that work at Equal Vision that were like good at those jobs to do it. We'd be like, can you wrap the Christmas gifts? And there was this one lady who like really liked doing it, and she would make them look really beautiful. So there's like the feminine arts that I wasn't good at, but I could play the guitar. So I got into 108, and we kind of, it was happened really fast, because we were like, we had a tour set up when I joined. So like I got into the band, and then we rehearsed, and we would leave the temple and go to rehearsal and play music. And then we went on tour for, I think we did a tour that was like 75 shows, or like ridiculous. Like we played every day for like, from like the first week of June until I went back to school. I remember I left one of the shows to go register for my classes, and then I came back to the tour. So it was like, yeah, and it was a godsend for me, because it was something I could understand and relate to. And the temple authorities, which sounds worse than it is, but the people that were the grown-ups at the temple, they actually saw what we were doing was valuable, because we were like, well, why don't you come see it? So we had a show at this place near the Philly temple called the Unisound, and the teacher, the main teacher from that temple was named Ravindas Farouk, and he came, and he was like, okay, what they're doing is awesome. And there were other, like a guru named Tamal Krishna Goswami, who's since left the body. He was like, no, you need to make them all surrender and distribute books. And he's like, I'm not going to do it, because what they're doing is something better and different than that. So I never knew this till like the last 10 years. So he backed our thing, and he said, they're creating a youth culture. It wasn't like we had this in mind. We just wanted to play hardcore music and sing about what we cared about at the time. But now there's like Krishnacore bands like in like Jakarta and like the Philippines, and like it's literally a worldwide movement that we accidentally started.
Yeah,
and it's crazy.
It is, and I've spoken to Balaram Das, for instance, over in the Philippines, and it is crazy because he now lives in Vrindavan, but yes, he got into all of this stuff because of you guys. So it was actually, he was an anarcho punk, and an atheist, but got through it, was reading yet again Thoreau and the Transcendentalists, and some Tolstoy, I think, and then kind of got into Krishnacore. But yeah, from Prabhupada coming over from India to give this to the New Yorkers, and then from Krishnacore has gone all over the world, and now it's gone back to India. It is a crazy journey. But so you're on this tour, but were you allowed to be on a tour with men, especially Steve, as you were dating? And you know where I'm going with this, don't you?
Yeah. I mean, well, basically what happened was we were going to go on the tour, and two things happened. One is we decided, let's get a second van and get whatever girls are into this, and we'll and they said like, oh, you have to distribute some type of literature. So we made we made fanzines. That was going to be the Equal Vision fanzine, and the I think Purcell had a fanzine, and then I had the Krishna Girl fanzine. I think the Krishna Girl fanzine came after that tour. But we were like, well, and we would bring like the Higher Taste cookbook and Easy Journey to Other Planets. We weren't going to do some heavy duty like book distribution, but we had to do that to get like sort of the blessing of the temple. And so there was Jay Ifer and I came to play guitar in shelter, and at the time he had a girlfriend who's named Nancy. Now she's named Nandananda, and she had converted this like old camper van into like, so we loaded the girls in that one, and then but before that, basically the person who's my guru called me into the office and said, you can't go on the tour unless you're married. And all my 21-year-old wisdom, I was like, okay, well, then I'll just get married, because that seemed like the logical, like definitely the great logical idea to do the next day. But we actually had a few shows. I think it was like we got married a few days after that conversation. But what we did was first we had to just play a show in Boston. And the Boston show was where the FSU riot happened. So we went to 108 plays, and like, I don't know, some Boston hardcore bands play, 108 plays, and then Shelter plays, and the FSU guys, which was a gang who now everyone's kind of friends, but at the time they came in and they started to heckle the band and heckle the kids. And they're like these big American Irish, but that's its own version of like thuggery. Boston hardcore, scary guys. And Ray says to the audience, okay, everyone sit down. Like, I don't know if it was like this moment of like nonviolent passive resistance. So just imagine this hardcore show with like 500 kids, and every kid sits down except like 6 giant, like they're in track suits, everything you imagine about like an Irish gang. They have the FSU hats or whatever. And they're just standing. Everyone else sits down. And Ray says, Steve's at the merch table, which is like his eternal thing that he always says, throw these guys out. So Steve is like, just goes up and just taps the guy on the shoulder and says, hey man, kids are just trying to have fun here. Why don't you guys just go? And the guy just fucking turns around and just punches him right in the face. And it immediately turns into like an all-out riot, like a riot where I've never seen anything like it. All the kids jump up and everyone's like brawling, and the FSU guys are brawling everybody. But what I see is 2 FSU guys or 3 have Steve. They've picked him up and they're like restraining him. And they're like taking him to the door, and the guys, and I think Steve said the guy saying, I have a gun, right, it's America, so like people have guns. And I see Steve, and Steve is like holding onto the door jamb, and like I was standing with our friend Lenny, and I'm like, I'm gonna pick up this folding chair and I'm just gonna go like beat these guys. I was like so adrenalined up, and Lenny was like, you can't, you'll get killed, you can't. He like held me back. But anyway, somehow Steve like escaped. But the long and short of it is we had our wedding the next day, and he had a big black eye at the wedding. I don't remember how. I think the cops came at that point. I think like the cops came and then they shut the show down. So they just dropped him and they ran for it. But he had, from that moment where the guy punched him, he had like a black eye. So, but being hardcore, we didn't think too much of the black eye. And if you see the wedding photos, he's got the shiner and the wedding photos. We had a second wedding, which was a more formal wedding for our family. But that one, we just got sat on these hay bales at Gitanagri, where we went after the Boston show, and we had this like Vedic wedding ceremony. Wait a second, hold on, I can show you this picture.
Yeah, sure, okay.
I don't think you can see his black eye, but I just have his picture in my kitchen. Let's see.
Wow. Yeah, I think you can. Can you see it? I think you can. Yeah.
Yeah. So, so that was us cutting our cake. We had this, I just have this in my kitchen because, that's what people keep around. So we went on. So basically the long and short of it is we had to be married. We obviously were not responsible enough to be married, but somehow it worked out. And I don't know how they thought that the two of us being married made the whole trip bona fide. And I realize now that's because the people that were like the temple authorities were like 30. So they also had no clue what was going on.
No.
Like now when I meet 30-year-olds, I'm like, no wonder nobody knew what was going on. We were all just trying to make it, like I think I think the oldest gurus at that time were like maybe like the really, really old ones were like 40, but a lot of them were in their early 30s, so they're so we were just trying to make it, and just trying to figure it out step by step and not and making a lot of blunders. But we got married and then we went on tour. And the funny story about that was Steve and I decided that we had to get some wedding rings to get married. So we were going to go to this really nice place in Brooklyn called the Clay Pot, and we knowing nothing about anything because I was like basically just 1 inch above being a teenager. We went to the Clay Pot and then we realized, oh yeah, these are like nice things and they cost money. So we had scraped together all our money in the world, which was like $200, and we took the subway to Brooklyn. We're going to get these nice wedding rings because I asked around, where should I get a wedding ring? People said, go to the Clay Pot. And we were like, each wedding ring was $250. And we were like, we can't do that. But if we go to Chinatown, we can go to one of the cheap spots and let's just look around there. And if we buy these, which I still have on my hand here,
Right.
we can get a $40 wedding ring and a $60 wedding ring. And then we can still go to the place everybody would go to at the time, which was called the House of Vegetarian, and have lunch. So that's what we did. And I know it's so funny. House of Veg was the place. That was the one vegetarian place, like this is pre like the rise of vegetarianism.
Yeah, I know. I don't think
So
people nowadays know how difficult it was to be
yeah,
vegan or vegetarian back in the 80s,
they had this, it was a Buddhist like Chinese place. So they had like fake meat and stuff, which you could get nowhere else, like in the country. It was like, so everybody would go down to Chinatown and eat at House of Veg it was just on Mulberry Street, I think. But anyway, so we got these wedding rings, got married, and then we took off on our tour. And yeah, the tour was fantastic. I mean, I think, it was kind of like that was the heart of, kind of when we established what Krishnacore was. Not like we didn't call it that. I don't even know when it started to be called that or where that term came from.
I think it was Eric Davis. Eric Davis wrote an article in Spin and called
Oh
it
yeah.
Krishnacore. I think
Oh,
that's,
it's
I
not.
think,
That's the first time.
yeah, it might not be though. These things are so ambiguous, aren't they? I know that
Yeah,
Dan Davis used to call it Haricore instead of Krishnacore.
Haricore. Okay, that's funny.
Yeah,
I never heard that. That's the first time I'm hearing that.
yeah. And so the $6 million question: you were in the temple and you were being treated differently as a woman. What was it like being on tour, and what was it like playing in a band as a woman at that time?
Well, I mean, so the temple life, obviously like was fraught with some gender imbalance, and I would say still has quite a lot of gender imbalance that it needs to get through, and that I don't think really serves and the purpose of developing Krishna consciousness and could actually be detrimental. That being said, when I toured, I think there was maybe, one other girl in a hardcore band that we saw during those 60 or plus dates or
Yeah,
65 or 70 dates. So, yeah, I think there were not that many women that, first of all, the shows were predominantly men in that part of the world and that part of hardcore. I don't know if that's true for all of hardcore. Um, but in New York, I mean, if you would go to a show, there'd be like five girls and like 300 boys. It was just the gender disparity was quite large. So, I think sometimes I felt, and this could have been just an internal thing, I felt like I should be proving myself all the time that I was good at the instrument, that I knew what hardcore was, that, there were the times, and this where it's like, you need to leave now. The band is sound checking. And I was like,
Yeah.
well, actually, I'm in the band, so I'm gonna be staying here now, kind of thing. Um, and which is just not true anymore. Like when I see my, hardcore now, I'm so psyched because there's so many women playing
Yeah.
and so many. I don't even think it's people are thinking about it, but I remember people asking me all the time, like, what's it like to be in a girl in a band? And I would think, I don't really know what it's like to be in a guy in a band. So I can't really say what the differences are. I'm sure men still feel those like worries that they're not playing well or different. Maybe they don't though, maybe that was it. But it was also like there were like we played one show at City Gardens with Into Another and someone like threw a bra at me on stage. Like they were taunting my femaleness. And there was definitely like talk about, oh, she sucks at her instrument. And I was like, I didn't suck at my instrument, but because I was a woman, I wasn't as good as Vic, but who's not that many people are as good as Vic. He's
Right.
he's a
Yeah.
different level of guitar play. But I remember feeling like there was this people, to some degree, people are kind of like waiting around to see if you fail or if you're just there as a token or whatever. And you feel like you don't want to just be a token. Like I was a hardcore person, like 100% as much as any guy was. So I did feel that sense of like, you know, what's my place? And there's a weird thing too, which I, thinking about more as an anthropologist, what people learn by imitating the people that come before them. And I didn't have anyone to imitate. Like
Right.
that was a
Yeah.
female. So I was like, how should I look? How should I walk? How should I dress? Like what's my thing? I had to just kind of there was no one to like, which is cool too, but there is a whole thing that's been imitated now so many times. If I see like, bands now, I just looking at these great photos from there was a weekend show called Tied Down, which was like a festival in Detroit, and like all the people in the bands they're doing the same jumps, they're doing the same moves that people were doing, in the youth of today in like the 80s. And I'm like, at some point someone did that jump for the first time and now it's been being imitated like 40 years in a row, the same mosh steps. At some point that was a spontaneous dance form.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
And since then it's just, but can you imagine something like from the 1940s, like the Lindy Hop or something? I don't know what people
Yeah.
did,
I do know what
dancing
you
the
mean.
same
Yeah.
way. Like somehow this has some lasting primal like thing that satisfies people. So, I mean, I really do get a kick out of the good parts of social media. They have all these, there's this one social media account where kids just drive around in a car and then they like jump out and make like a little mosh pit and then drive in and they record like the reaction of the people on this.
Yeah.
And I think, yeah. So yeah, I don't know. It's interesting that it's had such lasting effect, but I think that there's a lot of young people who are interested in Krishna consciousness philosophy, but they needed a way to like relate they needed to understand how because not everyone's going to become like a pukka, like fancy silk dhoti wearing Brahmin. But when you have the opportunity to be, well, it could be a silk dhoti wearing totally tattooed guy, but I think that it gave people, and also we were disruptors. So the disruptor part of it both helps you join a countercultural movement and reform the countercultural movement to be, I think, better. to be to we're punks are trained to recognize injustices. We're trained to recognize
Yeah.
inequities and issues. So when there's, every new religious movement, I would say religious movement, they have, if you believe, which religions do, that the authorities of the temple or the mosque or the church are speaking from God's words, then they have ultimate power. So that ultimate power can be very corrupting. So I think that the whole Krishnacore team kind of created like a Krishna consciousness 2.0 that's like more equitable, more open, more doable, more, it's not culty. It's I would imagine more in line with what it should be, if it was part of one's own culture from the get-go, then there wouldn't be this need to be like really authoritative and really punishing and things because you're just doing what you do. You don't have to try to like enforce things. So I see now we go to Super Soul Farm, which Steve and I are both a part of as in like investors, and which is Ray Capo's like place that he runs. And there's no women there that have ever even heard of women not leading kirtan. Like they don't even know that
Okay.
that used to happen. They don't have a clue. I said sometimes I'm like angry about it because I'm like, you guys have no idea how hard we fought to create this situation for you. They're just in there leading kirtan like it's no big deal. Whereas I had to like basically like fight the power to like touch the harmonium. But on the other hand, I'm so glad because they have this, they're having this experience with Krishna consciousness that's not paired with the trauma of the power structure, abusing its power or sort of misjudging how the power, their level of power or how the power should be wielded rather than maintaining a nurturing environment. There were some issues. So they don't even know about that.
Yeah.
They don't have any of that. They just have the good parts, and I feel like we help that. We help make that happen. And I'm
So
I'm so glad for that.
yeah, I think you're right. And Raj Kishore, he talks about it a lot in his book, doesn't he? And the injustices that he saw that was going on in ISKCON at the time, especially
Yeah.
in terms of women's rights, etc.
Yeah,
And
he was very aware of it. Yeah.
you know, so can you talk to you're currently doing a PhD? Could you
Mhm.
kind of go back a little bit? So could you talk a little bit about your MA, which I think is about this, isn't it? It's about this issue around.
Yeah, so my MA is a feminist analysis of the roles of women in ISKCON, and I'm rewriting it for a little clarity, and it's going to be published in the ISKCON Communications Journal. So I have to get that done. It's weighing heavily on me, and it's really emotional to revisit. But it's using feminist anthropology and philosophy to look at the ways that women's roles were like gender ideology was created and formed in ISKCON and the result of that. So, and it's also questioning if it really lines up. So, one of the main things that you hear right when you join the temple is you're not the body.
Yeah,
That's primal. It's in the Gita. It's spoken in, conversations. It's one of the foremost things. You're not the body. And, sometimes Prabhupada would say, if you think of yourself as black, or you think of yourself as Indian, or you think of yourself as male or female, then you're missing the philosophy. We're not supposed to think about it. We're supposed to think about the body as a temporary vehicle that we're actually a soul. So you're like, yes, this is great. And then they're like, except if you're in a female body, then you should stand in the back of the room.
yeah, yeah,
So and I think what was the hardest and most traumatizing part of that was the cognitive dissonance that you're supposed to maintain at all times. So you're supposed to think these teachers have the proper and in the case of ISKCON, the only path to liberation for the
yeah,
material entity. And yet they're saying there's the ideology and then there's the reality and they don't match. And in order to make it match, you have to live in this state of conflict, internal conflict, where you're one thing is being said and one thing is being done. And so I think even worse than where you stand in the temple room or whatever is this living in this state of conflict, internal
yeah,
conflict all the time, where you're being told one thing and something else completely is happening. And I think Prabhupada wasn't necessarily completely clear on that because he also was a human being from 19th century India, late 19th century, early 20th century India. And if you look at the history, and I really studied this in depth for my MA project, of what texts were translated and what texts were prioritized. You have something like the Manusmritis, which basically is very patriarchal and it
Yeah.
intends to maintain patriarchy. Other texts could have been chosen to be translated. You could have just translated poetry by Mirabai or poetry by Lala, who are basically these women who are like throwing off all, all societal norms and stripping naked and dancing under the sky and communing with Krishna. But they're like none of that, Even the six Goswamis like rejected Mirabai, even though she's like the most beloved poet of India to this day, or amongst the most beloved. So what is prioritized is a project of hegemony. Like it's not random. It's not random. And how Krishna consciousness is brought to the West, it's not random. They want to make a Krishna consciousness that's palatable enough that India can be seen on the world stage as part of the conversation of world religions. And if Christianity is at the top of that, they're going to take the things that don't line up with that, and they're going to downplay them, and they're going to play up the things that do align with it. So it could have happened so many different ways. And you see this when you interact with other lineages where they're like the sacred goddess traditions are emphasized and the Krishna part is part of it, but they're not necessarily it's not necessarily the emphasis, nor is this patriarchal social structure. But what I see is you have all these female members who were essentially all but, and actually, I think they were traumatized by the way that they were treated, because you're expected to agree to being treated as a second-class citizen based on your physical body, which you're also being told isn't really you. So and a lot of religions do this. All of the men's roles are being modernized and revolutionized so that men can live in the modern world, and women are expected, their bodies are expected to be like the site of holding what is perceived of as ancient and traditional. And I mean, you see that a lot of places. Like we have the Britterhof, who are Lutheran brethren, and the women still dress in these like Amish clothes, and the men just wear normal clothes. You see it with, different religious groups. You see that same thing happening. So I think it felt very oppressive. So what happens then is the women that sort of stick around, a lot of them are like kind of psychologically disastrous, and those are the women you get, which reinforces their theory that women are a disaster. And then the really smart, capable women are like, fuck this, I'm out of here, I don't want to be here, I can go be in the world and I can still read the books and do my own kirtan.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to be subjected to being treated like, like some of the things that are said, like women are like children and they should be treated. And at the same time, a second version of cognitive dissonance is happening, which is that you're being told that they're doing this for your protection. Meanwhile, we know women are being abused in the domestic sphere. We know that children are being neglected and abused, and we also know that women are not believed when they're said, like, I'm in an abusive marriage, and people are like, well, just try harder, so you're kind of like, you create like a situation that's super unnecessary and doesn't make people more Krishna conscious, and it doesn't line up with our philosophy. So my paper is interviews, and I many interviews I did with people from the very first generation, women who were initiated in the first and second initiation, all the way through the women that are like essentially would be their grandchildren or their two generations further. And the experience, there are some people who are, we have exceptionalism in ISKCON. So we take like one or two women and we're like, no, see, we have a woman in power, which slows the project of the liberation for all women down. But those women tend toward, orthodoxy and conservatism, and they have to be better. They have to be 10 times better than the men. I mean, we still have the question of the guru question. They're still saying, like, I can become a guru. That's totally fine. When I get a little older, I could become a guru according to their new resolution, but I have to be under the control of my son. Well, guess what my son's really into? Skateboarding.
Yeah.
So that would work out great. He should be, he's, he grew up as a devotee, so he like does the stuff and whatever, but he's never studied any Krishna conscious philosophy yet. But as long as I'm under his control, then I can be a guru. And I'm like, what? I'm like, you might want to meet our kids first before. But the whole concept that women can't be autonomous and they can't think for themselves and they have nothing to say and they can't understand the philosophy. Meanwhile, you have all these male gurus who have abused people sexually, or they've abused their
Yeah.
power, their authority, and you have no women who have done that. And you have these benevolent, amazing Prabhupada disciples who are humble, they're learned, they're scholarly, they've never missed a day of their chanting, they've raised children and done all of these things. And people are like, they're not really worthy of being a guru. And I'm like, then you really don't believe we're not our bodies. You really think we are our
Yeah.
bodies. And
Yeah.
that's been my frustration. So the paper essentially does all these interviews and shows the female experience within ISKCON and the little ways that are, really the little ways in which this society both enforces by the use of like social, essentially the threat of social death is like the biggest power that ISKCON can wield. I mean, they don't have a like a judicial system. So all they can really do is shun you socially or kick you out of the
Yeah.
temple socially, which people are terrified of because A, they'll lose their whole social like fabric, and B, like they don't want to lose their chance to become, to go to Vaikuntha. They feel like they might.
Yeah.
um, so there's a lot of like social currency of obedience where people obey because they want it to be, they feel like, okay, if I obey. And there's the use of, and I think misuse of, the understanding of what is ancient and authentic, which generally speaking mostly applies to women because they're men and they're, running all over and doing everything. And we don't hold men to the standard of that, but women are supposed to be these like trad wives or something. You're kind of like, and then we have the further sort of cognitive dissonance of like that was for Western women, but Indian women are out there being doctors and stuff.
Yeah.
So you're
Yeah.
like, wait a second, how is this like I'm supposed to drop out of college, but my friend who happens to be Indian, also a bodily distinction, is in medical school. But for
Yeah.
me,
Yeah.
education is the slaughterhouse of the mind. But for her, she's going to, and so I felt like there was just all these contradictions that I needed to talk about for my own, partially for my own sort of mental health, and also because I felt like someone needs to, or in an organized manner, lay them out, say what they are, hear from different voices. And I got some feedback that said, you probably only know what it's like in America. And I was like, absolutely not. I stayed in temples all over Europe when I was on tour with 108. I experienced these types of oppressive behaviors and expectations there. I what it's an international society. So like one of the women I interviewed, literally her parents are from Brazil. She
Yeah.
lived entirely her whole childhood in Mayapur, and now she lives in Europe. So that's not American. There's no American parts of those. And and then you have women, it's a very mobile society. So you have women converging in like the Dham in Vrindavan, and we're all experiencing it because they have a rule that women can never lead kirtan in the main temple there. And
Yeah.
they're sort of concession to it, which granted is a really lovely concession, but it's a concession. And when I bring yoga students there, they're like, "Why are the women only chanting in that other building?" And
Yeah.
so that it's been explained to me. Oh well, it's just too much because men will see these women and they'll fall down. And I'm like, if the men see a woman chanting the names of God in the temple room in front of the deities, and they're sexualizing women to the degree that that will cause them a fall down, the problem is the man, not the
Yeah.
women
Well,
who are there who want to chant for Krishna. And I just find that like until that really shifts, until men and women are allowed to chant in front of the deities. I mean, they give all these, oh no, well, you can chant at this thing, and this woman can chant at this thing, and this woman is like one of the sanctioned women, and she can do this. Then, and then I talk about the microaggressions of like putting all the instruments on the men's side. Well, guess who's not going to walk through a crowd of men to go pick up a madunga?
Yeah.
Like anybody, because we didn't feel welcomed to do that, and we also felt like it would be seen as like a disobedience or something. So I talk about those different things, and I don't know if it'll really make any difference, but it made a difference for me, and that felt good enough, for me.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you. Do you think it will make a difference? So
I don't know,
it
maybe
seems
they felt it
positive
was
that,
worth publishing. They felt it was worth publishing.
because I've obviously read parts of it, and it's very, very interesting reading. I mean,
Yeah.
and what you're saying about exactly those things about microaggression and about hegemonic structures around patriarchy and women, they're obviously there. And it's just really interesting for you to dig deeper and for you to do an ethnographic stroke, sort of anthropological study
Yeah.
around this situation.
It gave me tools to look at things that I knew were happening, but I didn't know how to understand them. So, like the idea of that's Clifford Geertz's idea of thick description of like just looking at ways that people interact in the temple that you could chalk up as nothing, but really are everything. Like the fact that they take the Giwa clamp and they offer it to the deities and they bring it to every man and boys, children
Okay.
first, and then the women can go. It's saying something. It's a
Yeah.
it's a way to maintain a structure. Um, if an example I give is, women, they let women give class once out of every 30 times in Mayapur, and fucking nobody goes to the class. So it's like
Yeah.
it's literally like it reinforces women have nothing to say, they have no contribution to make. And I don't have the data of like what it is currently of like how many times women give class versus men. Like that would be PhD level. But I do know that, when women were teaching at Gita Nagri, like just the men were like, well, I'm going to go like, take a hike or something because this is not worth my time. That tells you something, as especially like as a young girl. Like I was sort of like, well, then I'm not going to bother like knocking my head against the wall to become really good at teaching a class, because no matter what, like some of these women were so learned. They were literally initiated by Prabhupada in the first initiation, and
Yeah.
people were like, they probably have nothing to say.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't get more senior than that. My friend who she went to I she went to Leeds. She didn't go to Oxford or Cambridge. She went to Leeds, but
Okay.
that's Tolkien went to Leeds, right? Where did Tolkien go? Leeds.
Right.
He's a pretty good writer. People have liked some of his books. I'm making a joke now, but so she goes and she gets a PhD. She's from New Zealand. And she goes back to New Zealand, which is one of the most progressive and liberal parts of ISKCON. And she's like, yeah, I have a PhD and I grew up in the movement. But if there's a Bhakta there who's been around for like 6 months, they'll ask him to teach before me. She's like, I thought, getting a PhD would make a difference. And she's like, it doesn't. It means nothing, and I was like, yeah, I guess it's true. So it is just interesting how like male centered the movement still is, and like the whole world is. I mean, in America now we have this backslide, but it's like tragic, and it's a function
Yeah.
of fascism. I can't imagine why we would want to like let's align ourselves with the fascists. That will make it great, but to some degree I would say there are people that probably do align with that. There's a lot of politically conservative people who are super feel like something I feel like they confuse bhakti yoga with like conservative Christianity, but
Yeah. Yeah. I know that we've spoken about this before, in that sense. Um, I know you've only got an hour. I know we've
Mhm.
kind of got past that hour, and
Yeah.
those anthropological tools that you've kind of used to have a look at ISKCON and women, have you used them to look back on your time in 108 and to use them not in a kind of like a an academic sense, but to think about those microaggressions that was going on in the hardcore scene, in the 1990s, for instance, you know.
Yeah, no, but I really want to do a project that's like kind of looking back using for the through the lens of anthropology at that time. That's definitely on my list. That's one of the list. The other one is totally other, which is to look at sari weaving. But definitely feel like not just the 108 times. I mean, that's a really interesting one because my husband and I, we just had this is part of the project. This is the first stage one of the field work of the project. I
Yeah,
came home from school where I was presenting on feminist philosophy. And I came home and it was this day that H2O played in our town. And they're all sitting around the living room. And my husband was sitting like on the couch. And I'm like, wait, is this like some type of a guru? Just is this the Upanishads happening right now?
yeah,
So they were all asking him questions about Krishna consciousness, and all of them know a little something, right? So the whole hardcore scene has been like infiltrated by Eastern philosophy to a degree where like they know the terms. The best one is Hoya. You know who Hoya is, right?
yeah, yeah,
So
yeah,
Hoya somehow, one of the other guys in Madball has this big Hanuman tattoo.
yeah, right.
So I forget why. I don't know how Hoya knew all this, but he said, "Oh yeah, like that's Hanuman. He's the son of the wind. He was born in the
Right.
forest." You know, he starts to tell this like really accurate, like 20-minute description of the story of Hanuman, and I was just like, "Okay, this is freaking me out here." Like, he was like, "What did he say?" He's like, "Oh yeah, that." I think he even told me like details like Hanuman tried to eat the sun out of the sky, and that's where he got his name from, and all this stuff. And I was like, wow, this is like, everyone else is like DMS, like hanging out in the backstage, and Boy is telling me this like story from the Vedic literature. And I was like, yep, Krishnacore, we infiltrated the systems. Like the fact that everybody kind of and sometimes he'll, send me like a message. He calls me, by the way, he calls me Chakra Khan.
Does
Like,
he?
yeah, and he's like, I'll be like, "Yo, what's up, Keli?" Because he calls me Keli, which I'm not gonna correct Hoya. He's like, "How's your chakras?" And I'm like, "We've infiltrated hardcore. Like everyone kind of like just the amount of people who are vegetarian,
Yeah,
the amount of people who so many people go on. Some of them have some of the people that are like prominent Buddhist teachers in America are from the hardcore scene, like Noah Levine, who wrote Dharma
that's right.
Punks. There's
Yeah,
people that like, and they all kind of started to listen to Shelter in 108. And it's kind of like blows my mind because, we're just a bunch of kids blasting our eardrums and like writing as trying to find something to be angry about. Like, let's write about Gopinath.
well, it is amazing that as through my writing. In fact, I use Gopinath as an example.
Yeah,
You guys were just a bunch of kids, and it is just incredible to think, the lyrical content of 108. And Vic, what the guy's just incredible, and like you say,
yeah,
you're all in your 20s, and yeah, at that time you were thinking 30 was old, but
yeah,
now we look back at 30-year-olds and think, oh crikey, they're,
right.
they're, they're not old that old anyway, but 20-year-olds. I look back on my students, and they're all in their early 20s, and they're kids, and it was
Right. I mean, some of this
incredible.
stuff was like this, I and a lot of this was Fred. It was like this very subtle, fine understanding of like esoteric concepts that were like made into a hardcore song. It didn't seem crazy at the time, but looking back, I'm like, that's pretty crazy, actually. That's crazy. Like, just, and there's a lot of examples of it, just sort of concepts of like what Krishna conscious concepts that he was able to take and turn into these like hardcore songs that like also rock. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah,
at the
yeah,
time, we didn't think anything of it. Like the song Holy Name, I think, oh my God, this was like he had like the power of like almost like a Hafiz or like a Mirabai or a something like that. He was like having this like, really, I mean, to the degree that there were a couple times when the senior devotees were kind of like, this is a little too esoteric. I remember there was some interview and they
Okay.
said, what's your favorite poem? And I said, oh, it's the poem. And I can't remember if it's like Narottam Das Thakur or one of the Thakurs. And it's a poem where he makes a wish that he could become Krishna's flute so that he can be
Okay.
close to the lips of Krishna. And they were like, you can't write that. That's too sexual. So funny.
But
So yeah.
if you the Krishna Das from Invocation over on the West Coast, if you listen to his podcast, the guy is just like Raj. He's absolutely incredible, and listening to him talk. And again, I don't want to say he's a kid because it's quite patronizing, but he's a young man, and it's very, very intelligent, very, very well read, and the lyrical content. He the podcast was absolutely amazing. Just hearing him.
Which
Uh,
podcast was that?
it's with Krishna Das from Invoca, and it's on my YouTube channel where this
Oh,
is going
okay.
to go. Yeah, it's
Okay.
really, really, it's very,
I
very
just think
bright.
this is
Yeah,
proof of past
brilliant.
lives. It's
Yeah.
just proof of past lives because these guys just landed on the ground like they just needed a tiny reminder and then this like deep philosophical understanding. I mean, yeah, and it was an extraordinary time and I have to go meet the grad students in a minute.
I know. Sorry.
But I'll finish. Maybe we'll do this again because it's good, but we can go from this point from because there's a lot that happens after. But I think sometimes there are these like almost like portals, like where things open up. And I think that that early Krishnacore time was just like the opening of this portal where a whole bunch of us, I don't know if it was karmic or if it was past life or, I'm sure it was all of those things that so we were together in these spaces, which we created a lot of freedom in. The
Yeah.
hardcore scene was like the most free place you could be because you kind of, the rules were up for constant debate. We debated them all the time, but we were willing to do the work of hashing things out nonstop. We never were like, okay, well, it's just too much. We're not going to talk about that. We're like, let's fight it out. And you had all these extraordinary people who most of whom were already like thinking so deeply about why they wanted to reject American society. And they also were people that were like, you know what, I'm like people weren't vegetarian in 1980. Like nobody did it. Nobody like people. I remember my grandmother saying, "You can't live. You're gonna die." And I was like, "I'm not gonna die, Grandma."
Yeah.
But it was really radical, like really radical. And there were just things that were super radical that we were doing that I don't now they've been so normalized that nobody thinks. I
Yeah.
mean, you go to any restaurant in Albany,
Oh,
they
I
have
know.
they have vegan options on the menu.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
just created a new word. It's called a vemu.
Venue.
I just said it like one word. I'm a modern day Shakespeare, but yeah. So they basically, yeah, you have all these like that's normal now, and it wasn't normal. It was
No, no, it
extraordinary
wasn't.
then. Yeah. So, I'd like to think we were part of that positive force of change. I
Yeah, I
think
think
we
you
were.
were.
Yeah.
I think you were.
Good. So we'll wrap this guy up. Thank you for doing this project.
Yeah.
I can't
Oh,
believe
it's
you're
fantastic
doing it.
podcast.
It could
It
just
took
be
us.
off being an academic, but you're doing
Yeah,
this project.
it took us a few goes to get this together as well, didn't it? And then with you're soon to be a PhD, and I'm a PhD, and then we couldn't work out the time difference between the
Meanwhile,
two.
there's like a
It
clock
was,
on your phone we could have just looked at, but I never did.
but no, you go and meet those grad students. It's great. It's been great to talk to you, and I'll get this up, and no doubt, yeah, I'll message you later anyway. So
Okay, that sounds so good. Oh, this is good. The grad students are running a little late. So that helps me because I'll be 15 minutes late. But I think it was worth it for us to finish. So
yeah,
thank you so much.
thank you more. Thank you very much.
I'll
See
talk
you
to you
later.
soon. Okay, bye.
Bye.
Haribo.